The United States may have just stepped into the most dangerous economic shock of the decade, because what started as a military strike on Iran is now threatening to hit global oil markets, U.S. alliances, supply chains, and financial stability, all at the same time. Oil routes are at risk. Europe is divided, Iran's leadership is in chaos, and Washington is now openly discussing who should rule Iran next. If this conflict spirals farther, the cost won't just be measured in missiles or warships. It will show up at American gas stations, in the stock market, and inside the Federal Reserve's inflation calculations. The next 90 days could determine whether this becomes a regional conflict or a global economic shock. The crisis began with joint U.S. and Israeli strikes targeting Iranian leadership and military infrastructure. Those attacks reportedly killed Iran's supreme leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, creating a massive power vacuum inside one of the most strategically important countries in the world. Washington framed the operation as an effort to eliminate threats from Iran's nuclear and missile programs and weaken the regime that has dominated the country for decades. But the fallout was immediate. Iran launched missile and drone retaliation across the region, targeting Israel and U.S. military positions. Meanwhile, the conflict escalated dramatically when a U.S. submarine sank an Iranian warship near Sri Lanka, expanding the confrontation far beyond the Middle East itself. Now the conflict isn't just about strikes, it's about who controls Iran next. President Donald Trump has even suggested that the United States should have a role in determining Iran's future leadership, explicitly opposing the possible succession of Khomeini's son, Mojtaba Khomeini. At the same time, Washington is pushing its closest Middle Eastern ally to stay fully focused on the war. Trump has publicly called for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to receive a legal pardon in Israel, arguing that corruption charges against him are a distraction when the real threat is Iran. But while the military front is escalating, the diplomatic front is fracturing, and that's where the economic consequences start to multiply. Escalation layer. One of the biggest shocks of this conflict hasn't come from Iran, it's come from America's allies. Europe is deeply divided over the war. Some governments have quietly supported Washington. Others have refused to participate. Spain's government, for example, refused to allow U.S. forces to use joint military bases for the strikes, arguing the operation lacked international legal backing. That decision triggered an immediate political confrontation. The White House threatened to cut trade ties with Spain in response to the refusal. Meanwhile, several European leaders have warned that the conflict could spiral into a prolonged regional war, similar to Iraq, with unpredictable consequences for global stability. And yet, Washington still needs Europe. Even though the campaign began without a formal coalition, the U.S. military relies heavily on European logistics hubs, air bases, and intelligence networks to operate across the Middle East. In other words, America launched the operation largely alone, but sustaining it may require NATO infrastructure and European cooperation. And as geopolitical tensions rise, markets are starting to price in the risk, because the real economic vulnerability in this conflict is not missiles, it's energy. Economic breakdown. To understand the economic stakes, you have to understand one critical geography, the Strait of Hormuz. Roughly 20% of the world's oil supply passes through that narrow shipping lane every day, and right now, that route is under threat. Military clashes and missile activity have already disrupted shipping traffic through the region. If Iran attempts to block or attack vessels in the strait, the impact on energy markets could be immediate. Oil prices historically surge during any credible threat to Hormuz. For the United States, that translates directly into higher gasoline prices. But the economic chain reaction goes much further. Energy shock. If oil prices spike sharply, American households will feel it quickly. Gasoline, transportation costs, airline tickets, shipping, and manufacturing inputs all rise with energy prices. Even a $10 to $20 increase in oil prices can ripple across the entire U.S. economy. That pressure feeds directly into inflation, and that puts the Federal Reserve in an extremely difficult position because just as inflation was stabilizing, a geopolitical energy shock could reverse the trend overnight. Supply chain risk. Iran also sits near several critical global shipping routes. If the conflict expands across the Persian Gulf, shipping companies may begin rerouting vessels. That means longer shipping times, higher insurance costs, and increased freight prices. American companies importing everything from electronics to industrial materials would face rising logistics costs. This is exactly the type of disruption that previously fueled post-pandemic inflation. Defense sector boom. But not every sector loses. Historically, major geopolitical conflicts drive massive increases in defense spending. The U.S. military is already conducting large-scale operations across the region. Missiles, naval deployments, airstrikes. Each of those requires replenishing stockpiles of precision weapons and advanced systems. That tends to benefit American defense contractors, companies involved in missile systems, aerospace technology, and military logistics. If the conflict continues, Pentagon procurement budgets could surge. Financial markets. Financial markets hate uncertainty, and this conflict introduces three major unknowns simultaneously. First, how long the war will last. Second, whether Iran retaliates directly against global energy infrastructure. Third, whether the conflict expands to involve regional powers like Hezbollah or other Iranian proxies. When investors face this level of uncertainty, capital usually moves towards safe haven assets. That means U.S. Treasury bonds, the U.S. dollar, and gold. But even the dollar dynamic could be complicated. If energy prices rise sharply, the U.S. trade deficit could expand, increasing imports of expensive oil. That could weaken dollar stability over time. Consumer impact. For American consumers, the biggest risk is a combination of three forces hitting simultaneously: higher fuel prices, higher shipping costs, and renewed inflation pressure. Those factors raise the price of everyday goods, from groceries to electronics. If the Federal Reserve is forced to keep interest rates higher for longer to contain inflation, mortgage costs stay elevated, credit card interest stays elevated, and economic growth slows. In other words, a war thousands of miles away can still translate into higher living costs in the United States. Strategic outlook. So what happens next? The next 30 to 90 days will likely determine the trajectory of this crisis. There are three possible scenarios. Best case scenario. In the best case, the military strikes succeed in weakening Iran's command structure enough to force negotiations. Regional powers push both sides towards a ceasefire, shipping lanes reopen, oil prices stabilize, and markets recover. And the conflict becomes a short-lived geopolitical shock rather than a prolonged war. Base case scenario. The more likely outcome is prolonged tension without full-scale escalation. Iran continues asymmetrical retaliation using drones, missiles, and proxy forces. The U.S. maintains military pressure, energy markets remain volatile, and the geopolitical standoff drags on for months. Under this scenario, the global economy absorbs a moderate but persistent inflation shock. Worst-case scenario. The worst case is a regional war. Iran attempts to block the Strait of Hormuz. Hezbollah opens a northern front against Israel. U.S. forces are drawn into a prolonged military campaign. Energy prices spike dramatically. Global shipping collapses across the Persian Gulf, and the world faces a major economic crisis driven by energy shortages. What investors and policymakers will watch? Several indicators will determine which path this crisis takes. First, shipping activity through the Strait of Hormuz. Second, Iran's leadership transition. If a stable successor emerges, tensions could stabilize. If the power vacuum triggers internal chaos, escalation becomes far more likely. Third, European alignment. If NATO partners eventually support the operation, the conflict may gain broader international backing. If the alliance fractures further, Washington could face diplomatic isolation. Soft close. History shows that geopolitical shocks rarely stay confined to the battlefield. They spread into markets, alliances, and the global economy. And right now, the United States is navigating all three simultaneously: a volatile war, a divided alliance system, and the world's most important energy corridor sitting on the edge of disruption. And the next 90 days will decide whether this becomes a global economic shock or just another geopolitical headline.